This broadcast is made possible by the friends and partners of LibertyNetwork.live. We thank you for your support.
Tonight, we're going to take a look at man-made global climate change from a biblical perspective, and also just look at some of the facts. Next week, we'll have another special week as Avi Lipkin's son, Aaron, will be with us next Wednesday. Of course, Avi, we met in about 2006 when I was first getting involved in learning about Islam. Avi is an expert on the subject. He's from Israel, and we became great friends, and he's been in our church a number of times, and this will be the first time, I believe, we've had his son, but it will be we will be glad to host him and give us an update on what's going on over in Israel, and so I hope that you'll enjoy next Wednesday night. It'll be very, very special. Well, as I said, tonight we're going to do an overview of man-made global climate change. We're going to look at the facts and the politics about man-made global climate change. Well, obviously, 2016 was not that long ago. Everyone assumed that it would be just a smooth transition from Barack Obama to Hillary Clinton, but the destruction of our country would just remain on course as one was handing off to the other. Nobody suspected, including myself, that this guy actually had a chance to win the 2016 election. Of course, nobody had ever honestly run on a campaign of making America great. We are very familiar with political candidates that have great stump speeches, but then once they get in office, nothing ever happens. But President Trump surprised everyone. And quite frankly, in his first term, him being in office and the MAGA movement was untenable to the globalists as they were working to destroy the sovereignty of America, because we are really the last roadblock to global government. And as we talk about frequently in our church services, we're not opposed to global government when King Jesus is sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. That's the global government that we will enjoy and want to be a part of. However, what's going on right now, I believe, is the 10 horns of Daniel, the 10 toes of Daniel. I think it's very similar, if not identical, to the World Economic Forum and their effort to create a global fascist world. And, of course, President Trump is actually representing the United States of America. Well, having him in office that first term, they had a plan that they would knock him out. And quite frankly, I think it revolved around COVID. I think COVID was successful beyond their wildest dreams. I don't think they were able to overplay their hand, because I don't think they were going to be as successful as they actually were. But by the time they regathered themselves and we had awakened, and thank the Lord, we were able to stop the decay in 2024 and get back on this right track. But, COVID was something that I don't believe just happened. It's interesting that a month before the very first COVID case, we saw this event held at the Pierre Hotel in New York City. It was hosted by Johns Hopkins, the World Economic Forum, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they were wargaming or doing a study on what the global response would be if a bats to people coronavirus wound up spreading across the planet. Now, what a coincidence that 1 month later we had the first reported case of coronavirus. And of course, we all lived through that crazy several years. And understand that it was all planned. It was not by accident. I believe this whole thing was an effort to make sure and knock Trump out, because early on in 2020, he was a shoo-in for re-election. You remember our inflation was as low, in fact, right now it's as low as it's been since he was in office, but things were really working and heading in the right direction. And quite frankly, some of the stuff that we were forced to swallow just doesn't make any sense. They talk about this flu-like virus that was unique, that was sweeping across the planet, and mom and pop shops had to close down. However, the large big box stores, the national chains, were able to remain open. Now, folks, if you're trying to fight the spread of a virus, that doesn't make any sense at all. If you're trying to advance towards communism, then it makes great sense. Because in a communist society, you have the 1% that actually owns everything and rules everything. And then you have the 99% that is all equally impoverished with no rights. And the middle class is the danger to a communist implementation. So they like the elites because they're the elites, and then they want the rabble, which we is the rest of us. But the idea of having a middle class is what defeats communism, and that's why the mom and pop shops were forced to close. But the big box retailers were able to stay open. Abortion clinics and strip bars were able to remain open, but churches and schools had to close. A virus doesn't work that way. Then, of course, the idea of making sure you wear a mask as you're walking into the restaurant, but once you're seated at your table, you can take your mask off. Well, again, I'm not a doctor, I am not a scientist, but I know that viruses don't work that way. And, of course, we saw President Biden's Build Back Better, and that was not his theme for his campaign. That was actually the World Economic Forum's theme to try to switch the world over into their globalist tyranny. And fortunately for us, there was a Donald Trump that we were able to elect and stop this nonsense. But the globalist intent to reset the world is still their goal. And I believe during the tribulation period, there will be a certain amount of success that they reach in trying to establish that goal. Of course, we know what happens over the course of that 7 years. But the United States of America is the last roadblock to globalism. And fortunately, it seems that there are several countries that are starting to awaken, and we are certainly thankful for that. But I want you to understand that climate was the tool that they wished to use in the first place. You know, COVID wound up being sprung on us, but that really wasn't Plan A. Plan A was using climate to convince us to shelter in place and do some of the nonsense that we actually went through these last several years. I'm going to show a quick video clip from a 2021 interview between CNN director Charlie Chester and someone from Project Veritas. But listen to Chester's words, and they'll confirm exactly what I just spelled out for you.
They've already announced in our office that once the public will be open to it, we're going to start focusing mainly on climate, climate like global warming, and like that's going to be our next like I don't know, like what's the word I'm looking for? It's going to be our focus. Like our focus was to get Trump out of office, right? Without saying it, that's what it was, right? So our next thing is going to be for climate change.
Well, CNN, Charlie Chester, again, admits what I've just told you and what we all knew to be true. They had planned on using this fraud of man-made global climate change to implement some of the restrictions that actually were poured out on us these last 5 years. Now, I've got a job to educate the modern group. I mean, our people in our camps, our pastors that we work with, it's imperative that we understand what's going on right now. But more so than that, we need to make sure that our children understand what's going on, because they can outweigh us. You know, if the plan is establishing a global government over the entire world, and we are standing firmly in place saying no dice, well, I turned 63 this month, and I'm not in the best of health. How long am I going to be around? I don't know, maybe 20 years. How long are you all going to be around? You know, we are adamant in what we believe. We know the truth. We defend the truth. But when are we going to be around? Maybe another 10, 15, 20 years. And what happens, what's important is what happens in the next generation and who is training them up as far as not only this fact, but many others. Let me show you this video.
And are frightened?
I worry. My mom worries. The water might rise and it might flood the whole town.
We won't be able to survive for long.
What are you most worried will happen?
We'll all die.
Are there some people who say this isn't true?
Yes. Yes.
Might they be right?
No.
How do you know they're not right?
Well, because the Earth is getting hotter.
Where do you learn this?
Can't you see? Oh, can't you see what global warming is doing? Can't you see? Oh, can't you see what global warming is doing to me?
One of the main components after educating the students of global warming is that they're given a letter for their families to sign, and this is the congressman or woman. It's for Congress to pass.
So this is what's going on. The kids aren't being taught to read or write largely anymore, but they are being taught how to think about man-made global climate change and transgender and any other number of things. So in the remaining time we have tonight, let's look at and dispel some of the myths about man-made global climate change. First of all, fact number one, climate is always changing. In fact, the climate goes through trends of warming and cooling periods, and it always has gone through periods of warming and cooling. As a matter of fact, that's what God said when Noah got off the flood and got out of the ark after the flood in Genesis 8, verse 22. It says, while the earth remains, there will be seed time and harvest. There will be planting and harvest. There will be cold and heat. There will be summer and winter. Day and night shall not cease. Now, my friend Warren Smith reported in his work, Clear Thinking on Climate Change, he reminds us that the modern era of instrument-driven or derived record keeping goes back only about 150 years to the 1880s. Satellite data goes back only about 40 years. That means we don't have a baseline of global data that predates the Industrial Revolution. But from the data we do have from the 1880s until about 1910, the data suggests that the Earth was cooling. Then from 1910 to 1940, the Earth seemed to be warming. Then from 1940 until 1975, we had another cooling trend. And then after that, we've had a warming trend. So in the 150 years of instrumentation, we have seen 2 cooling periods and 2 warming periods, and this is a normal occurrence. This is a pattern that the Earth goes through. In fact, in the 1970s, politically motivated scientists were trying to convince the world that we were on the precipice of the next ice age. Then, in just under 30 years, the same scientists, using the same tools of propaganda, changed from cooling to warming, and we aren't going to die from an ice age, we're going to die from global warming. Well, now they have just decided to call it climate change, and no matter what the weather does, they're right. But whatever it is, the claim is that it's man's fault, as this United Nations poster will tell you. It says, I'm sure you have humans. You see, the Earth has a thermometer in its mouth, and it has a fever. And, of course, people are the problem. Man is what's making the Earth sick. Now, it's interesting that the Bible says that God put man on the earth as his representatives to bring order and to manage it. Yet the Davos crowd, in fact, the Bible tells us to multiply and fill the earth, but the Davos crowd has long been on record of wanting to reduce the world's population. So you see a major difference between theism and atheism. As you see, theism is very much adamantly pro-life, and atheism is pro-death. Now, this will be hard to believe, but I'm going to start very simply. Surprisingly, the thing that has the most effect on our temperature on Earth is that big orange ball of fire in the middle of our universe that's called the sun. And scientists have long known the intensity of the sun is not consistent. As a matter of fact, our sun has an 11-year activity cycle. During that 11-year period, the number of sunspots per year rises to what scientists call solar maxima. And that number then falls in the next 11-year period to what scientists call solar minima, as this NASA article from 2012 verifies. Now, these are normally in predictable ranges. However, occasionally, in a pattern that these scientists do not fully understand, the maxima and the minima break out of their limits and have more extended warming and cooling patterns, which, as this article from NASA confirms, and of course, this is the significant component to our current claim of global warming. So warming and cooling is normal on planet Earth, just as God told Noah and as science readily knows. Some examples of some of the warming that's going on. The Great Mendenhall Glacier is near Juneau, Alaska. As the ice is melting during our current warming period, they are finding evidence of forests that once filled this area. So forests once flourished where the Mendenhall Glacier is today. What does that tell us? It tells us that it wasn't always that cold in Alaska. At one time, it was warmer, even to the point where they had forests growing in the same area. As a matter of fact, did you know that the Vikings at one time farmed Greenland? Roughly 1,000 years ago, the Vikings settled on Greenland and farmed there, and then all of a sudden, after a period of time, their existence at Greenland ended, and they no longer lived there. Well, what does that say? Well, it tells us that at one time, Greenland had a much more hospitable climate than one it has today. As a matter of fact, did you know that the Thames River in London would freeze solid and freeze so solid from roughly 1600 to 1800, there'd be several months in the winter where they could actually have festivals and carnivals and fairs on the Thames River during this period of time that history calls the Little Ice Age. And of course, it was during this period of time that General Washington had to weather a severe winter with his army at Valley Forge. So understand that climate is always changing, and it always has, just as God said would happen when he promised Noah. As a matter of fact, this chart, using proven scientific analysis of instrumentation over the last 150 years, and then prior to that, they can discern heating periods and cooling cycles by studying historical records, historical data, and by studying tree rings. They have learned that there have been periods of heating and cooling that far exceed what we've experienced in the last 75 years. As a matter of fact, has anybody here ever heard of the Roman warming period? Well, if you're a member of our church, you obviously have, because we've taught on this before. But if you don't go to this church, you probably never have. Have you ever heard of the medieval warming period? No, unless you go to this church, it's probably never been brought to your attention. I wonder why that's never been brought up. Because it doesn't fit the narrative. Because the narrative is that we, with our gas-powered automobiles and SUVs and airplanes, that man is causing the climate to erode because of our technology. However, as this shows, there have been periods of time in our history, going all the way back to the birth of Christ, where it's been warmer than it is now, but you can't blame that on SUVs because they did not have SUVs. It's been cooler than it is now. I'm sure, as I just mentioned, you've heard of the Little Ice Age. Well, that wasn't caused by man in his SUVs or in his private jet airplanes. Obviously, those did not exist during these periods of time. As a matter of fact, the world flourishes during warming periods, just as plants grow better in greenhouses than they do in ice boxes. Now, if fossil fuels were truly the cause of global warming and cooling, then explain these periods of times that I've just introduced to you, the medieval warming period, the Roman warming period, the Little Ice Age, long before there were any SUVs and the kind of comfort items that we enjoy today. They weren't in existence, yet there have been periods of cooling and warming that exceed what we have today. Now, fact number 2. CO2 is not a dangerous greenhouse gas, as we are told. CO2 is plant food. That's why they add CO2 in greenhouses, because it's plant food and it helps the plants to grow beyond normal. Now, this is an expert from Dr. Patrick Moore, who was a co-founder of Greenpeace. He is not one of us. I don't know if he's a Christian or not. He believes in evolution, but at least he's scientifically honest enough to tell the truth about CO2. Listen to this statement.
Carbon dioxide and water are the two main constituents of all life. Carbohydrates and of course fossil fuels are hydrocarbons, just missing the oxygen. But when you burn them, the oxygen is recombined with the carbon to form carbon dioxide. And people need to learn more about the chemistry, because this is fake science and it is driving a very dangerous movement on the energy front.
And driving a whole political party.
So point number one is climate is always changing. Fact number two is CO2 is not dangerous. CO2 is in fact plant food. Fact number three, regardless of the amount of CO2 produced, nature absorbs 50% of whatever amount is produced. And remember, life on Earth depends on this stuff. Plants convert the CO2 to oxygen in the process called photosynthesis, which all of us were taught in elementary school and in junior high. Now, as I mentioned earlier in a humorous light, the sun is the biggest factor on global warming. Now let's take a layman's view of greenhouse gases and solar activity. The atmosphere around the Earth serves our Earth as insulation does to a house, keeping the Earth from getting too hot or too cold. Intensity of the sun is not consistent, but it depends upon sunspots and solar flares. As energy from the sun increases, the Earth's temperature increases. As energy from the sun decreases, then the Earth's temperature decreases. I know that is a shocker. You're glad you came just to learn that little bit of information. The ocean, which covers about 70% of the Earth's surface, is the largest contributor of CO2 to the atmosphere. It's not cow flatulence or your SUV. Here's a simple demonstration of how it works. The sun heats the Earth. The ocean then produces evaporation from the sun shining onto its surface. Evaporation becomes clouds. The clouds reflect the sun and cool the Earth. What a miracle of creation, a built-in global thermostat. The precipitation cycle consists of rain in warmer areas and snow in cooler areas. Now, in the warmer regions, rain that is not absorbed into the earth runs into streams and rivers and eventually runs back into the ocean. Whereas in colder areas, snow falls in Greenland and in Antarctica, does the same thing. But rather than flowing into the ocean as liquid, ice shelves continue to flow slowly downhill, where it finally dramatically breaks off into the ocean, making the breathtaking videos that we often see that pinheads like Al Gore use to try to deceive us into thinking that that's not normal in some way. And occasionally, these icebergs melt. Sometimes they drift into shipping lanes before they melt, as is what happened many years ago with the Titanic. But as long as it continues to snow in Greenland and in the Arctic, there will be ice shelves breaking off dramatically into the ocean, making those dramatic photos and videos, but that is normal. And there's another effect, which can something that can affect cloud cover on the Earth's atmosphere, and that's volcanoes. This adds to what would normally be cloud cover, shielding the Earth from the sun's rays and causing colder temperatures. In 1816, it was called the year without summer, as there was a giant eruption at Mount Tambora. In fact, the temperature on the Earth dropped 5 degrees as a result of this volcano and the ash that protected the Earth's surface from the direct sunlight. So, a summary of some of the facts we've looked at so far. Climate always changes, and it always has. World history proves that there have been periods of warming and cooling continually since Adam and Eve, and other than the flood of Noah, nothing is out of the ordinary. We know, fact number 2, that CO2 is not a dangerous greenhouse gas. It's plant food. And fact number 3, the atmosphere around the Earth serves as insulation, making sure we don't get too hot or too cold, just like a greenhouse maintains optimum conditions for growth, hence the term greenhouse gases. Now, let's dispel some other climate myths. In Al Gore's 2006 panic porn movie called An Inconvenient Truth. He said that polar ice caps were melting and sea levels could rise by some 20 feet. What's interesting is that Al Gore bought oceanfront property after that. Now, if you really believe that sea levels are going to rise 20 feet, do you think he would go buy oceanfront property? Do you think Barack Obama would have oceanfront property? Well, of course not. They may be deceitful, but they aren't idiots. But we have been able to measure the depth or the rate of the growth of the shoreline. At Battery Park in New York and Manhattan, they have measured it since 1850. And it has risen consistently since 1850 at the rate of 1.1 inch per decade and has not changed in 176 years. So what does that tell us? It tells us that sea levels are not rising abnormally. It's doing what it's always done, at least for the last 2 centuries that we've been measuring it at Battery Park. And by the way, the polar ice caps are not melting either. You remember back in March of 2020 when some climate activists set out to prove that the ice caps were melting, and while they were sailing to the Arctic, their ship got stuck in the ice. Doesn't God have a wonderful sense of humor? Another little tidbit, hurricanes are not increasing. The National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration says this on their website. In summary, it's premature to conclude with high confidence that increasing atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations from human activities have had a detectable impact on Atlantic Basin hurricane activity. So what they're saying with those fancy words is there has been no evidence that it's made a difference in hurricanes at all in the Atlantic, although increasing greenhouse gases are strongly linked to global warming, so they say. Human activities may have, now notice the terminology there. They're not making the statement that they have, they're just trying to lead you to believe that they have. Human activities may have already caused other changes in tropical cyclone activity that are not yet detectable due to the small magnitude of these changes compared to estimated natural variability or due to observational limitations. So, the polar ice caps are not melting. Hurricanes are not increasing. The sea level is not increasing. Well, what about forest fires? I know we all hear that forest fires are more prevalent now because of man-made global climate change, but actually 2 things have happened. Number 1, we have greatly villainized logging and stopped the thinning of forests. Now, rather than being under the dominion of man, forests are just growing unchecked, and they're much more vulnerable to wildfire. And then also, since the 1970s, we have changed our strategy of addressing forest fires. Up until the 1970s, we attempted to put fires out. Since the 1970s, as this slide from the U.S. Forest Service will attest, the new official policy is to let them burn. Now you mix in 24-hour news who's committed to liberal politics and policies, and we have a nonstop coverage of every flood that happens on planet Earth or every forest fire that happens anywhere around the world. And as we no longer are trying to put them out, we just film them and put them on the news 24 hours a day and try to create hysteria and point to ourselves and say that we are who to blame for all this. It's not true. In 2018, Hurricane Florence did not provide the destruction that the media was hoping for, so they attempted to con us. I think you will enjoy this video. You're going to see this reporter fighting with everything he can to stand against these hurricane-force winds. Notice what goes on in the background when he doesn't see what's happening behind him.
Okay, picking it up here in Wilmington, North Carolina, right at the Intracoastal, and we're in one of these vans. This is about as nasty as it's been. We had some vans like this last night, and then the eyewall this morning, we were not on TV. It was the dark and raucous.
We talk about AI and not being able to trust what we see anymore. We haven't been able to trust what we see. You see this guy, a member of the media, is trying to fool us to believing he can barely stand against the wind. And you got two guys behind him across the street just taking a stroll because it really wasn't that bad at all. So man is not causing climate change. Climate has always changed, and it always will, just as God promised. Now, Upton Sinclair was a Pulitzer Prize-winning author, an activist, and politician from the 1930s. He famously said, and listen to this, "It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it." When you tell scientists that you're not going to be hired or published unless you believe in evolution, then it's not a coincidence when they accept that evolution is true and believe that lie. When you tell your employees that they'll not retain their jobs unless they celebrate gay marriage during Gay Pride Month or celebrate gender identity, then it's not surprising how quickly man conforms to make sure he continues to get his paycheck. When you tell doctors that masks stop viruses when you know they don't, but they'll lose their license if they don't play along, well, then you get what we have just lived through these last 5 or 6 years. And when you hire a scientist and fund their research and tell them to find evidence that man and fossil fuels are responsible for climate change, then that's exactly what they're going to find. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his farewell address in 1961, made a number of significant points that all need to be paid attention to. This is just one dealing with the area of science. He said, "Today, the solitary inventor tinkering in his shop has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists and laboratories and testing fields, partly because of the huge costs involved. A government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. We must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific technological elite." President Eisenhower called it dead on the nose, and that was, 64 years ago. You're going to get what you pay people to find. So what is the reason behind all of this? Well, as we saw in the opening video, the reason was the attempt to knock down national sovereignty and get us to cooperate into global governance for the fear of survival. Just as we lived through the COVID pandemic, it was all about survival. Give up your freedom, give up your private property, give up your job, give it all up so you'll survive. And that's the same thing with this situation. If we are going to cause the world to burn up or freeze up, then we are the problem, and man had better be ready to hand over some of his sovereignty and some of his unalienable God-given rights so that we'll survive. But as we have seen, that is not the case. We are not under the threat of destroying ourselves because of man-made global warming. Here is another Patrick Moore quote. By the way, we're going to wrap up here in about 5 minutes. I'm going to let you out early because Sunday I kept you a long time. So this will show you that I can finish early as well. But enjoy this video. It's very thorough. Listen to every word that this man said. Again, he is not a Christian as far as I know. He is not a conservative Republican. He is not a creationist. He's an evolutionist, but he's intellectually, scientifically honest enough when it comes to this subject. Listen to this.
The whole climate crisis, as they call it, is not only fake news, it's fake science. There is no climate crisis. There is weather and climate all around the world, and in fact, carbon dioxide is the main building block of all life. That's where the carbon comes from in carbon-based life, which is all life on land and in the sea. And not only that, a little bit of warming would not be a bad thing for myself being a Canadian, and the people in Russia wouldn't mind a little couple of degrees warmer either.
But Patrick, you know, there are so many scientists who have come out and have said that climate change is real.
Yes, of course climate change is real. It's been happening since the beginning of time. But it's not dangerous, and it's not made by people. Climate change is a perfectly natural phenomenon, and this modern warm period actually began about 300 years ago when that little ice age began to come to an end. There is nothing to be afraid of, and that's all they're doing is instilling fear. Most of the scientists who are saying it's a crisis are on perpetual government grants. On one hand, they say the science is settled and people like myself should just shut up because they know what's right. On the other hand, they seem to keep studying it forever as if there's something new to find out. And those two things are completely contradictory. Carbon dioxide is actually a benefit to the world. I'm in Washington this week for a directors meeting of the CO2 Coalition, whose purpose, and you should take a look at the CO2 Coalition online because we have some of the top scientists in the United States and Canada on board, and we believe that carbon dioxide is entirely beneficial to both the environment, to agriculture and forestry, and to the climate of the earth.
Patrick, I know you were president of Greenpeace in Canada, 7 years as a director of Greenpeace International. You founded this organization and then you left. Why were you one of the founders and why did you decide to leave?
I was one of the founders as doing a PhD in the late 60s, early 70s in ecology. I was radicalized by the Cold War and the threat of all-out nuclear war and the emerging consciousness of the environment, and we did a lot of good things. We stopped nuclear testing in Alaska, we stopped it in the South Pacific, we saved the whales, and we stopped a lot of toxic waste being put into the ocean and the air. But by the mid-80s, we had gained a lot of notoriety, and we were bringing in a lot of money, and we were hijacked by the extreme left, who basically took Greenpeace from a science-based organization to an organization based on sensationalism, misinformation, and fear.
Very well said, and you may debate whether I know what I'm talking about, but you probably believe that he knows what he's talking about. Well, that's going to wrap up for this evening. Again, I'm going to let you out early, but this is what I'm going to tell you. How many of you have kids in the building? If you have children in the building, you cannot go get them yet. So just hang out in here, visit for a little bit of time, have some good fellowship, and you can pick up your kids when they are done down in the Awana classroom. So stand if you would. I'm going to close this in a word of prayer, and then feel free to spend the next 15 minutes just fellowshipping in here before you go and get your children. By the way, we'll have this polished up, and we'll have it on our website available within about 2 to 3 days if you'd like to use this on social media. This kind of information most of the world is not privy to, and it's out there. Again, much of my interviews today that we aired here were taken off of interviews with this well-regarded scientist, and has been on Fox News, but most of us have never seen it before because it's designed that way. They don't want us to know what's going on.